Most early region patches come with a plethora of new weapon options to choose from, and this one is no exception. We have one new 5-star option, that's the signature of Xilonen, and 3 new gacha weapons, I believe. But what do these weapons do? How good are these weapons? Are they worth picking up for your favorite characters? Let's answer these questions, starting off with the new 5-star weapon and then going on to the new 4 stars. Peak Patrol Song is the newest 5-star sword being added into the game. It offers a low base attack and a high defense percent substat. Passive of this weapon increases the user's defense by up to 6% when the user normal or plunging attacks, stacking up to 12%. Additionally, when the user has obtained the maximum stacks necessary for the defense percent passive for every 1000 defense the user currently has, the team gains a 10% damage increase to all damage sources other than physical damage, capping at 30% damage bonus at 3000 defense. However, buffs from the same weapon but on different characters can not stack. The best thing about this weapon is the large team-wide percent damage bonus, making it the perfect offensive stat stick for many defensive support-focused characters. Speaking of, this 5-star sword signature holder, Xilonen, is the best in slot wielder of this weapon for obvious reasons. Xilonen primarily scales off of defense and little else. She doesn't need energy, she doesn't need crit, she doesn't need damage percent, she just needs defense, and this weapon grants the most defense of any weapon in the game. But the real draw of this weapon is the damage percent buff that it grants to the entire team. This ends up increasing anyone's buffing potential by such a large amount that it surpasses most other weapons in the game in terms of buffing prowess. For specifically Xilonen, this increases her percent damage buff potential from 0 to 40% to 30 to 70%, which is massive. This is especially the case for off-field units as well as Dendro and Animo DPS, who she would have been unable to reliably buff before. In terms of this weapon's viability on other characters, it's first important to note how impactful the full damage percent passive is to the main DPS. If we use Ito as an example, it will get around a 14% damage increase from the 30% team damage buff. Off-field units usually deal about 25 to 50% the damage that the main DPS deals, which means that when switching off of a supporting weapon, they would need about 2 to 4 times the damage increase from their personal weapon over that of the supportive option. With that in mind, this is Albedo's and Chiori's new best-in-slot sword. This weapon is so good on Albedo that it ends up dealing the same damage as his Cinnabar Spindle while also buffing the entire team. Uraku Misugiri is a bit closer to the damage increase he would need to match the damage increase that Ito would get from Peak Patrol Song, but it still comes out short. The situation is the same for Chiori, as her signature would prove to be better than Peak Patrol, but Peak Patrol offers a buff to other units in the party. This would make Peak Patrol her best-in-slot weapon at lower investments, as a higher investment Chiori demands more stats for herself. That just goes to show how brokenly overpowered this weapon is. The only downside is that this percent damage bonus scales on the user's defense, but even when using this weapon on the sword user with the lowest defense in the game, that of which being Kirara, and not gaining any defense other than what Peak Patrol offers, this weapon would still offer the team about a 13% damage bonus basically unconditionally. This weapon is incredible for many supports that don't output a lot of damage for themselves. This includes the current best defensive support in the game, Bennett, where this weapon proves to be his new best buffing weapon in the game. Even on Arlecchino, who benefits much more from attack than many other main DPS units in the game, this weapon surpasses all others in terms of the offensive buffs it offers. That's not even to mention that it would also be buffing the likes of Yolan and Xingqiu, which Mistsplitter, Key of Kajnasut, and Sapwood all cannot do. This weapon is truly one of the best weapons in the game at the current moment, as it buffs all sources of damage and with a very easy to fulfill requirement. While it may push you to build directly into defense to get the most out of the passive team-wide damage percent buff, the raw stats Peak Patrol offers would allow every sword support in the game to provide the team half the buff that this weapon can provide at max. That makes this weapon super versatile, as it can be used on Xilonen, Albedo, Chiori, Bennett, any form of the Traveler, Lynette, Layla, Jean, Shichi, Kazuha, Kirara, Xingqiu, and Kaya. For all of these units, this weapon will be a contender for one of their best in slots due to the very strong, versatile, and easily accessible percent damage buff. This weapon is, simply put, one of the best weapons in the game. If you don't plan on going for Xilonen, I do recommend you pull for this weapon at some point in time. But with the main attraction out of the way, let's now move on to the 4-star options. The first of these 4 stars is another new sword in the Sturdy Bone, which offers a large large base attack and an attack percent substat. The passive grants the user's normal attacks increased scaling based on 16% to 32% of the user's attack, scaling on refinement after the user uses a sprint. However, this effect has a limit of 7 seconds or until it activates 18 times, though it has no internal cooldown right now, so it might be reactivatable very easily. Additionally, it decreases the stamina consumption of sprinting by 15%. This weapon has a very good passive and it grants the stats for many characters to use this passive well. However, there are only 2 units that can use this sword to the fullest, but it is still a very strong free-to-play option for the both of them. For both Ayato and Clorinde, this sword turns out to be on par with a Refinement 5 Finale of the Deep starting at Refinement 2, but after that point, it is just better. Once at max, it becomes both of their second best in slot 4-star swords, as they are both only behind the likes of the Black Sword, which you need to pay directly for. Outside of those two, no one else works particularly well with this weapon, since everyone else deals a large majority of their damage through sources other than their normal attacks. So if you don't have Ayato or Clorinde, or if you do and you have better weapons on them, then you can ignore this weapon in its entirety. If you don't, I still actively recommend against this weapon due to how strong Harbinger of Dawn and Finale of the Deep are while being free to play. But if you do somehow get it to a Refinement 3 or higher, then maybe it would be a good idea to build it up for your favorite character. Mountain Crushing Nail is the next potential gacha weapon that's arriving, and it offers a large base attack and a low energy recharge substat. Its passive increases skill damage by 12 to 24% based on refinement, and this effect doubles for 8 seconds after an ally other than the user uses an elemental skill. Additionally, it reduces climbing stamina consumption by 15%. This polearm focuses on buffing elemental skill damage, but there are only 2 polearm characters in the game that focus on this type of damage. While this might sound like it's the perfect weapon for Kachina, it's not. Kachina already has a lot of damage percent from her passive and artifact set, but she has a pretty low defense stat for her pure defense scaling kit. This means that raw defense is usually the best stat that she could ask for, putting this weapon behind the footprint of the rainbow by nearly 2%. This weapon provides a damage output about halfway between footprint and Favonius Lance, but Favonius Lance has the benefit of generating energy to the team. Mountain Crushing Nail just does not do enough for Kachina and her teams to warrant using it over her best free-to-play option or her best supporting option. While this doesn't end up working too well for Kachina, it does for the only other elemental skill damage dealer, Emilie. Mountain Crushing Nail is so good for Emilie because it offers her an insane 24 to 48% damage bonus to her elemental skill, which is her main damage source. On top of that, it eases her energy requirements while also providing her a large base attack. This weapon is so good for Emilie that it ends up being tied with Deathmatch for her best in slot 4-star weapon option at Refinement 5. Even without refinements, this weapon would still perform better than Missive Windspear and many other free-to-play weapon options she might have. Despite that, I still cannot recommend going for it just for her unless it is on her weapon banner and you're trying to secure her signature polearm. Emilie has a high stat requirement because of her inability to be buffed by many units and her lack of supportive utility, meaning that the poor weapon would lead to a poor performance. Her signature Lumajuice Elegy fixes that, as it offers her so many large stats that she needs to deal damage that it will almost always be more valuable to go for than any other vertical investment option. Considering that Mountain Crushing Nail might be a gacha specific weapon, her signature might even be easier to obtain since it can be guaranteed. So while Mountain Crushing Nail is good for Emilie, I will actively recommend against it for these reasons. Fruitful Hook is the last new weapon to mention. This thing offers a large base attack and a low attack percent substat. The passive grants plunging attacks a 16 to 32% crit rate increase, and after a plunging attack deals damage, the wearer's normal, charged, and plunging attack damage increases by 16 to 32% for 10 seconds. This claymore is a specific plunge attack damaging weapon made specifically for the one claymore plunge attack DPS we have in the game. Gaming is the premier plunge attack DPS for claymore users, as he's the only one who can use this claymore without any additional tech or ally assistance. Gaming's kit heavily amplifies his plunge attack damage since it has a huge multiplier, it has no elemental ICD, and it gets a large 80% crit value increase from his 6th constellation. So obviously this claymore would be his best since it grants his main damage source an extra 32% damage bonus and 64% crit value increase, and And yeah, it kind of is. Gaming's potentially best-in-slot weapon is Serpent Spine, which largely increases his total damage percent while also offering an insane amount of crit rate. It offers only about 5% less crit rate than Fruitful Hook, but 18% more damage percent to Gaming's entire kit, not just Gaming's plunging attacks. While a vast majority of Gaming's damage will come from his plunging attacks, his burst still vapes, and so would his first normal attack if weaving them in, which would both be buffed massively by Serpent Spine. The downside of Serpent Spine is that it has a low attack and it requires avoiding damage or getting a shield in order to keep it at max stacks. So while it may be better at maximum potential, it does limit Gaming's team comps and also can be much worse than I presented if he loses any amount of stacks. This puts Fruitful Hook ahead of Serpent Spine all around as his best in slot weapon. However, the Rain Slasher also does a lot for Gaming when weaving normal attacks into Gaming's rotations. While Fruitful Hook is better at just plunge attack damage, the Rain Slasher is not far behind while also performing better when normal attacks are weaved into his rotations. Since you normally do want to do this anyway, because he has some downtime and most Hydro supports require normal attacks to function, Rain Slasher will normally be about just as good as a Refinement 5 Fruitful Hook, except in teams where he doesn't vaporize, but that nukes his damage anyway, so I don't know, you do you. All around, these weapons are all pretty strong, with the main event Peak Patrol Song being one of the best weapons in the entire game. The 4 stars are also incredibly powerful options for some characters, but they are limited in usability and they might be gacha specific weapons, making them exponentially more difficult to obtain than a 5-star weapon. This is their largest drawback, as if they were not gacha specific, I would have a much easier time recommending them. But that's all I have to say for these new weapon additions. What are your thoughts? Do you like them? Are you going to pull for any of them despite my suggestions against it? Do you plan to pull for Peak Patrol Song, or are you going to skip every single one? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. But with that, I will skedaddle. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you all next time. Bye bye!